Thank you so much to all of you for giving up your Saturday to join us. For us policy wonks, I can't think of anything I'd rather be doing on the weekend. And we have a really great lineup of speakers who I will introduce shortly. We're also streaming live and really glad that we'll be having many people joining the discussion online and participating. And we'll use some Slido details shortly in terms of how we can share those questions. So we have around 50 minutes for this discussion. We're going to hear from each of the panelists before turning over to all of you for your questions. And so why are we here? I think, we've had some really interesting discussions over the last 24 hours in terms of global connectivity and how we start to think about building back better, stronger together from COVID, both in the UK and in communities rooted here in Coventry, but also internationally. And this was really the key leading theme of the UK's recent presidency of the G7 as well. And I think how we choose to respond to these shared global challenges is really, what defines us, whether that's health pandemics, whether it's climate change, whether it's economic and political uncertainty in different places, but also thinking about what are the opportunities and those shared opportunities that we can look to unlock. We've seen unprecedented advances in terms of innovation, technology and science, in terms of connectivity between communities all around the world, with communications, the movement of people and ideas. How do we harness this in this environment to really support connected, resilient communities, both at home and abroad? So we're really excited. Today we have George Freeman, founder of the festival, former Minister for Life Sciences, Trade Envoy, and a very illustrious background before that. We have David Lyon, Director from Impact Agri, who's really going to look at things from an agribusiness perspective as we start to really drill down, thinking from some of these global challenges to anchor the conversation a bit in terms of hunger and malnutrition. We have Bashar Ahmed, the Executive Director and founder of Shabaka, a social enterprise and research organization really working with diaspora communities and how we engage diaspora communities in humanitarian preparedness and response. And we also have Simon Bishop here, the CEO of Power of Nutrition and chair of the Coalition for Global Prosperity. He's really going to help lift up some of the policy conversation and really why nutrition really matters. So it's also, just thinking yesterday, the privilege that we had to hear from City of Culture leader and artist Laura Nyai, who spoke yesterday so eloquently on the migrant experience and the idea of how we support, again, this idea of community resilience, both in terms of communities of settlement, but also in countries of origin. And I was really interested to read that Coventry, 24% of the population here is born overseas. So how do we really harness that richness, that diversity in terms of taking forward sustainable growth here and as part of our contribution as Global Britain? And then we're really going to choose to take a bit of a deeper dive, explore issues of like I say, of hunger and malnutrition. Malnutrition is still the biggest killer of children under 5 across the world. And we really risk at this time, particularly with the impacts of the pandemic, both in terms of health impacts, but also the economic impacts of sliding back on so much of the progress that we've made in recent years in driving down child mortality and maternal mortality. And there's such a key role that we can play as global citizens and as the UK, and to start to think about those opportunities for Global Britain as we start to kind of define what our role in the world is next and how we link our development assistance, our diplomacy with the trade and business opportunities to really think about unlocking those pockets of excellence in industries such as global health, life sciences and agribusiness, so we can really lean into making these global contributions. So that's enough from me. I will hand it over to each of our panelists who's going to make a short opening statement. Then I will ask a few questions and we'll start to get all of you engaged and involved. Please do either, we'll have questions at the mic, but also join at slido.com. With hashtag Big Tent 21. I think you have to put the name of the tent. Are we third space? and you should be able to submit your questions there. So we'll be taking questions from those online and from in the room. And with that, I will hand over to our host, George.
Eleanor, thank you very much. And a big shout out to all those watching online. Sorry you can't be with us, but it's great to have you in person, as it were. Look, I'm going to do three things. I want to share 3 facts with you, tell you one story and give you one idea. Eleanor's mentioned my background. I was 15 years in venture investing in food, medicine, energy, the broader bioscience, agri-tech, med-tech and clean tech, and then got elected in 2010, managed to persuade David Cameron that as well as a deficit strategy, we needed a growth strategy and that we should have an industrial strategy, which was sort of heresy in conservative circles then. And we then did one, and I led the first one, the life science strategy. It was a 10-year strategy, wasn't designed to fit the political cycle, and I did it in a cross-party way. Never did I think that by launching Genomics England, NHS Digital, the MHRA accelerated access reforms, we'd have a pandemic 10 years later and what value that would have. And I just share that story because if you do the right thing for the right reason, often there are consequences that you didn't anticipate. And this year we've seen the benefit of that industry and the power of some long-term strategy. So 3 facts. First fact, last year, Britain put on £1 trillion of debt and 35,000 tonnes of fat. I'm responsible for quite a chunk of the last number and a little bit of the first number. I mean, this country is heavier and poorer and largely less healthy, quite seriously less healthy. But I sense, I think certainly in my community, in my family, in myself and in this community, there is a commitment to lose that weight, to get fitter, to get healthier. People heard the bird song last year and they cooked more actually and ate more, obviously, and they discovered that when you come off the treadmill of the modern working daily cycle, there are quality of life gains. And I think part of what's going on is people are wanting us, yes, to get back to work, but in a way that's cleaner and healthier. And a big theme of this festival today is clean and healthy growth going together. Second fact, by 2050, the world population will be 9 billion, and we have to more or less, it's not quite double, about 75% increase food production on the same land area with half as much water and energy. In terms of human development, the history of the human beings on this planet, that is a massive grand challenge. Hands up, all of you who are optimistic about it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm hugely optimistic about it, and I'm excited about it because agricultural science, agri-tech, the next industrial strategy I launched, is all about how we produce more with less. There is an alchemy in this. We can actually produce more with less by harnessing the power of genetics so we can breed crops that are drought-resistant, disease-resistant. We can now use satellites so we only spray the crop that needs it in the field, not wash the whole field with chemicals. We can massively reduce the inputs and increase outputs. But we don't just need to do that here. We need to do it internationally around the world to help those countries where the population growth is coming. So let me share with you a story. I went out to Lebanon 3 years ago and to the Bekaa Valley with the Save the Children and the Bill Gates Foundation to have a look at what we're doing out there as the UK to try and help those Syrian refugees, Lebanese population 1.5 million, 1 million refugees. Pretty traumatic for little Lebanon, hugely destabilizing. We should be really proud, by the way, of what British aid is doing out in the Bekaa Valley. And as a Fen farmer by origin and background, I looked at the Bekaa Valley, the most unbelievable fertile soil. And I found myself at a workshop the Red Cross were running with Syrian refugee women who'd been through hell. You cannot begin to imagine what they'd been through, escaping Daesh, coming over the mountains to this refuge. And they were being trained to bake. There were 30 Syrian women, and at the front was a Red Cross person with, like Delia Smith, with big pots, teaching them how to bake. And I sat at the back and thought, don't these women already know how to bake? But what do I know? I'm a white bloke from London who's just flown in. I just sat there and waited. And at the end, they said, we're delighted we've got a VIP visitor from the UK. Any questions? And I said, yeah, I've got one question. How many of the women here already know how to bake? And they all put their hands up and turned and looked at me like, finally, somebody asked what we were all wondering. They were so grateful to be helped that they felt it would be rude to ask. So I said, second question, how many of the women here actually they're not here to learn how to bake. They're here because they want to start a cooking business. every hand. And then I asked the Red Cross, how much of this course deals with how you actually start a company, how you actually start to do food? Nothing. We were actually infantilizing these poor women who'd fled Daesh. They wanted to start businesses. They wanted to start to earn a living to send back to their families. And it was great work, but we were teaching them something they actually already knew how to do. And I gave the Red Cross a hard time and said, is anyone here helping people start food businesses? And they said, oh yes, we've got a program somewhere. I discovered Lebanon's only about 5 miles wide. So I said, let's go now. I want to go see it. And they said, well, it's not on your schedule. I said, change your schedule, let's go. So we turned up at this poor lady's house. And as we arrived, this whitewashed sort of villa in the Bekaa Valley, a cornucopia of fruit, veg, courgettes hanging. I mean, it was amazing. And she was quite suspicious, this car with a flag on the bonnet and all these people in red T-shirts from Save the Children. Who is this guy? We sat down and I started asking her about her business. And she was sort of, who is this guy? I'm the translator. And she kept saying, is he from the government? Is he from the tax office? I said, how much are you? And we got to the point. She said, yeah, I make jam. We went out and she showed me her shed. And in the shed were about 1,000 pots of the most beautiful jam. She was running quite an operation. And I said to her, how much jam do you produce? And she said, who's he and why is he asking these questions? She was shipping jam, 5 vans a week, basically a van a day down into Beirut to all the hotels. How many do you employ? And she said, who is this guy? She said, 7 officially, 27 unofficially. She's running a really serious venture. And I said to the Red Cross, have you guys helped? They said, yeah, we donated the shed. And I said to her, do you want to expand? She said, yeah, too right, I want to expand. I bought an option on the plot of land. I want a German factory. They're the second-hand equipment from Germany. That's the best. I want to be producing. And she's an entrepreneur in the Bekaa Valley, where the going rate for Hezbollah is $100 a month. She was the best force we've got against terrorism in the Bekaa Valley. Building a business, creating food on the front line of international development. And I share that story with you because it seems to me that the real challenge for us is to harness our science and technology in the UK. We're still the global powerhouse in nutritional science. To use the City of London to finance great technologies, take them global, use our aid budget. So here's my idea. Why don't we pick a few countries around the world where we know our way around? East Africa, Libya, Lebanon, Kenya, Bangladesh. And for those countries, offer them a deep development partnership. For you guys, we'll double our aid commitment to you. We'll double our security commitment to you. We might even take on some of the poachers in Kenya that are killing the tourism industry and some of the pirates that are frightening off tourists. And we'll 10x our trade. We'll invest in your infrastructure, in your food. We'll sign a technology transfer agreement with you. We'll give you accelerated access to our agri-tech. We create export markets. I think that would be a way that we'd inspire people that Britain is really doing some good in the world, create markets for our technology, which we're brilliant at inventing and terrible at commercializing. We give the city something to finance rather more valuable than derivatives they don't understand that bankrupt us. And it would actually support the heroes on the ground around the world who are actually trying to lead in feeding the next generation.
Thank you, George. And that's really kicked things off with a bold idea. And I encourage all of us to kick out some of these kind of creative thoughts and to make this a really solutions-focused discussion. And I think just building from this, then we'll hear from David and your thoughts from an agribusiness perspective.
So I'm David Lyon from Impact Agri, and we look at 2 sort of different challenges in agribusiness. We're focused in sub-Saharan Africa. And on the one hand, you've got the small-scale farmers and many initiatives over the years focusing a lot of them on staple crops haven't really delivered the promise, and you don't see the economic transformation that you'd want to see that will change livelihoods and improve nutrition. On the other side, you've got large commercial farms, quite a lot in South Africa, you see quite a lot in other parts of the world, which have technology, which have finance, which have the markets in place, but are not necessarily inclusive. You don't see the impact in terms of the wider economic development around them. So our question is, how can you take some of the approaches that you see in some of the commercial farms and deploy them at a small scale? And that's the challenge that we focus on. The first thing is, if you talk to the larger farms, they'll admit that if they don't have the technology, the irrigation, the storage, the processing in place, their company, their farm that might have been around for many generations will collapse. So you need to have the whole ecosystem of a value chain in place, particularly the market, particularly the technology. And if you're thinking about issues like climate change, etc., bringing in farming systems that introduce, that build the soil, so regenerative agriculture, which is very important, that you are able to deal with water scarcity, so you have irrigation, and critically a stable market are all key elements. And that's what Impact Agri, we work in bringing those together. So how does it actually work in practice? Well, the way we try and work is we try and have a core training farm as small as we can make it, which has a number of farmers going through the system and coming out of that, setting up enterprises that take the technologies you might be seeing used at a 2,000 hectare scale into enterprises that are only 2 hectares. And we do that by bringing in shared infrastructure. So we provide the irrigation, which they pay a service for. We provide the offtake and the storage, again, which is a commercial arrangement. And the aspiration as we develop this approach is these enterprises will expand organically themselves. The services will expand to other farmers. And you see examples of service businesses across West Africa and elsewhere, the sort of Uberization of farm equipment is there. You've got digital services linking into local markets. And this is what's providing access to vegetables and other crops across a number of markets. So you've got a core farm, you've got shared services, and you've got the enterprises. But the problem is there's a real aversion towards financing this. Africa is seen as risky. Agriculture is seen as even riskier. And if you say you're coming with what's seen as a greenfield project, you'll be shown the door in many cases. And the trick is to match the perception of risk with what you're actually investing in and bring in multiple sources of financing. You're not relying on development finance that only works in selected areas, and in some cases is short-lived, because we're talking 10 years, 10, 20 years. We're not talking 3 years. So you need to have a combination of equity. The diaspora is particularly important if understanding the countries and markets they work in. Development finance has a role in unlocking, but also all the risk mechanisms, the guarantees, the insurance, etc. And it's being able to structure that in a way that gets these 3 elements of a core farm, shared services, and small-scale farmers off the ground. And that's basically our work. And we work predominantly within Western and Southern Africa is where our focus. And we focus on high-value export crops, which in a discussion about nutrition might be something we explore. I'm happy to talk about why we do that. But the main reason is going into established value chains is what gets things off the ground and leads towards economic transformation. And you can then move into vegetable and other crops where you need cold chains and you need a whole range of different areas of infrastructure to work at scale. And our focus is getting to scale rather than another pilot project, of which there are many, many that have gone over the years. So that's our background.
Thank you so much, David. And I think,
All right.
jumping in, excited by the conversation. And I think shortly Simon's going to talk to us a little bit more about some of the kind of, both the role of innovative finance, but also some of these kind of different multi-stakeholder partnerships and how this has a key role, particularly in advancing nutrition. But I think first, Bashar is really going to ground us more at the community level as well, and really what this means.
No, no, thank you, everyone. And no, it's a pleasure to be here. And I think it's, Eleanor, this is quite an important discussion, when we're talking about ending hunger and malnutrition. But there's so many layers as well. It's not just dealing with the end results of it, but let's look at the roots as well. I will start just talking about our experience at Shebeke, where we look at building our evidence based on a diaspora engagement in humanitarian action, so preparedness, response, and recovery. I think firstly, let's tackle the word diaspora. I think it's one thing that kind of everyone is like, what is this? So essentially, it's a reference to communities who have lived for a significant time outside their origin countries or were born outside. It was a term that was mainly used in reference to people who have fled traumatic events, such as a reference to the Jewish diaspora and also the historical African diaspora. But it's used a lot more widely. And for those who are kind of doing academic work, we can spend probably at least a week discussing the term and its definition. I think one of the important things is about diaspora engagement in responding to, ending hunger, malnutrition, but also just responding to crises, is to recognize that diaspora actually becoming such an important actor and is slowly being recognized. If we talk about just kind of like numbers, diaspora globally, remittances for 2020 was more than $500 billion US. If you compare that to FDIs and ODA, finance direct investments, that came to about 260 billion, whilst ODA, official development assistance, came to, I think, just under 160 or 170. So that just gives you an idea, the power of the remittances from diasporas. And this is what you have on paper. This does not include volunteering, time, knowledge exchange. So there's a lot of layers to take into consideration into that. What we've seen in terms of the work we've been doing with just kind of responding to COVID, everyone expected that, diaspora, and I will refer also to migrant communities, the support to origin countries would drop significantly, but no, they've actually continued to provide that kind of support. And I think this is where we need to actually, I would love to kind of hear from the conversation here today about how do you engage with diasporas? How do you harness that power in the work that you do? How do you build partnerships and trust? And diasporas are very diverse. You talked about, city of Coventry, about 24% were, born outside of the UK, but from many countries as well.
Yeah.
So there's diversity amongst the diaspora. There's different needs. There's those who actually engage in philanthropy, but there's also those who might need significant needs. And I think this is where also kind of like in the UK, we need to start creatively. How do you engage with the diaspora? I was having a conversation with my colleague Paul earlier. What about the British diaspora? Have we talked about that? I know we talk about the expats in Dubai or in Spain and such, but let's look into that as well. The UK is also an important place for sending remittances. I think that it's in the top 20 countries in terms of sending remittances. They send double in terms of remittances in comparison to what is received. But still significantly smaller than other countries like Qatar, you have South Korea, where the amount of remittances sent from these countries is much higher. So in terms of dealing with how diaspora engage in not just humanitarian response, I think something is also that shows the power of diaspora is they don't distinguish between development, so the contribution to the SDGs, or this is an emergency response that's needed. They work across the spectrum. So we've seen in terms of data that they'll send diaspora will send remittances, but when the crisis hits, they actually increase the amount they send to that crisis in terms of the response. And we've seen so many examples of this. For example, in Somalia, in the response to the famine, at the Somali diaspora in the UK really kind of raised a significant amount of funds to try to support with a response. So I think I will leave the discussion for now here, because just to kind of start thinking about practical examples of how we can work collaboratively. And I'll pass on to Simon, if you don't mind. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
No, I think I've got. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to start with celebrating success because we live in bleak times and we too often forget to do this. And so we have to remember that we have halved extreme poverty around the world in the last 25 years. Malaria deaths are down 2/3, AIDS deaths are down 40%. And in this area, stunting, for example, which is children who are too short for their age or mentally impaired because they haven't had the right nutrition. In 2000, that was 1 in every 3 children. We've got that down to 22%, so close to 1 in 5. So there's an awful lot to celebrate, and it shows that the world can make progress if it focuses on things. That said, as Eleanor pointed out, we're obviously seeing that progress rode back. There's still 150 million children out there who are stunted, and we're seeing those figures go back up. There are 41 million people right now, 2/3 of the population of Britain, who are on the edge of famine. And of course, the relevance to this is, to the subject of the whole of the Big Tent Festival, is you can't build back better if you're hungry. You can't think straight. You'll learn less at school. You're more likely to get ill, including to contract COVID. You're more likely actually to turn to extremism and other things that offer hope and possibly a source of food. You're more likely to get involved in conflict, because if there's a lot of people and not enough food to go around, that leads to conflict. You're more likely to migrate. So this issue is absolutely at the heart of building back better and of resilient communities. And if I just give you the example of Madagascar, 43% of children are stunted in Madagascar. If you don't get the right nutrition by the age of 2, so the first so-called 1,000 days from conception through to age 2, some of that stunting, the physical and mental impairment, is irreversible. It is a life sentence, not a prison 14-year life sentence, a life sentence. So there's a moral imperative to tackle this issue, but also just think about that. That's 43% of that country's workforce in 15 and 20 years' time are physically and mentally impaired. That literally hobbles Madagascar for the foreseeable future. I think, and this builds on some of George's comments, as well as colleagues on the panel, Britain is already very good at sectors that need to come together to tackle this issue, whether it be agri-tech, as we've heard about, whether it be our amazing civil society organisations, whether it be 10 years of global leadership by the British government on this issue, whether it be that we have some of the biggest food and beverage companies in the world, and we have the city where innovative finance is exploding at the moment, and I'll hopefully get an opportunity to talk about this more later on, and I'll point you to the Halo Trust event later on this afternoon where they'll explore this more too. We're very good in these areas already, but there is an opportunity, this is a best of British opportunity for us not just to be very good, but to be world leading. And for tackling global malnutrition, both home and abroad, to be a central pillar of global Britain moving forward. And that's my big idea for today, and I look forward to discussing it more with you in the rest of this session. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think we'll kick things off in terms of questions and a wider discussion with all of you, and also from those submitting online. But I think what's really surfacing, and I think in the kind of spirit of that optimism, is how do we look at, both stopping the slide back on some of those gains made, but also accelerating progress and using this opportunity where, as George has said, people don't want to go back post-COVID to kind of business as usual ways of doing things, both in terms of our kind of international work, but also in terms of kind of communities in the UK. And how do we start to foster some of these kind of smarter collaborative approaches that engage diaspora communities, that engage entrepreneurs, that engage the research community alongside government, alongside private sector, and really spin off some of these ideas to take forward. So I think that that's our kind of challenge, to start really thinking about those solutions and those collaborations. Do we have, I'm just conscious of time, do we have any burning questions in the room? Should we take questions here first and then we can move online? If you would like to come up to the microphone, sir, that would be great.
Am I required to speak with? Oh, that's better.
Yeah, you're fine.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My question is a two-part question, not two questions, of course. One, do we have, is the work that the panel have been talking about audited? Because it's really hard when one's doing good work to acknowledge mistakes, but it's obviously very important to do so that we can do things better. My other comment is that whilst I'm completely, I think it's our duty and responsibility to do what we're doing and more in the world as far as overseas work, where I live in London, in Finsbury Park, particularly among, I guess, but not only, BAME persons, there is an issue of malnutrition, because there's about, there must be 10 fried chicken joints in my locale. Can we use and utilize some of the tools of measurement and practice and finance and auditing to try and address some of these issues of malnutrition at home? Because these are going to be costs. Fried chicken today is going to be, as we all know, diabetes tomorrow, and huge costs, which if we're spending it in the NHS, we can't devote it to overseas help. That's it. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you. And I think just splitting up the question in that way, firstly, in terms of kind of auditing different programs and tracks, perhaps, and learning from mistakes and learning, perhaps if we can hear from Simon first in terms of some of the implementation programs, but also David, because this is something that you do day in, day out in your programming. And then perhaps I will ask George to respond on nutrition at home and internationally in some of those shared learnings. Simon, do you want to?
Yeah. So in terms of the Power of Nutrition's programs, we have 17 programs in 13 countries. Literally had new figures in this week showing that by the end of this year, we will have prevented 600,000 cases of stunting. Those figures have come in from Johns Hopkins University in the States, entirely independent, world leading at measuring programs. And that sort of, I hope, illustrates how the importance we put on auditing, but that it's done by world leading academic institutions and they are thoroughly independent. And I think it is worth also just acknowledging, often British aid gets challenged on this issue. It's actually the most transparent and accountable element of all government spending that's out there. You have the International Development Select Committee, but you also have ICAI, the Independent Commission on Aid Impact. If you go on the now FCDO website, Dev Tracker, there is more information about British government aid spend than there is on health or education or anything domestically. So that the scrutiny, the auditing and the accounting of all of British government aid spend as well is significant. And I should say I used to work for a special advisor for Justine Greening when she was the Secretary of State. So this was driving value for money and making sure the money was spent well was like one of our top priorities. So I know this area very well. And I genuinely believe, of course, there is a small slither of bad spend. And of course, it's hard to operate in these environments. So sometimes it doesn't go right. But the vast majority of the money does achieve incredible goodness. And there are umpteen mechanisms of accountability to make sure that happens.
So
thank you, David.
From our side, obviously for our agribusinesses, we we measure the impact and the commercial returns as an integral part of the business. But we also want to look at what else happens in the private sector. And while some of the large, we referred earlier to some of the large large food companies, which many of them are UK-based, they will audit all of their programs, which you can track that back, but actually the impact isn't really particularly material. Maybe it's a slightly radical thing to say. And it's questioning what is the end outcome of what they're doing is as much important as to what can you audit what the actual activity. So using the example of Madagascar, which we mentioned earlier, there's a huge amount of companies that work as traders. They're not really supporting the growers. So if you look 10 years down the line, you'll have many of the same problems you see today will still be there. You have huge, many of your companies are doing huge programs on livelihoods, but you can't see what is the impact going to be in 5-10 years' time. And it's not what you're measuring, it's not how you're measuring, it's also what you're measuring. And holding the private sector to account is as important as looking at the wider aid sector as well.
And I think just jumping in there from a kind of philanthropy and impact philanthropy perspective, as well as looking at kind of UK aid, but also the private sector piece as well, we're really interested in outcomes. And I think ensuring that those, there's that strong evidence base from research institutions, as you were saying with John Hopkins, that these are proven interventions that we're investing in, and it's a complex environment in terms of health system strengthening, but we are seeing reductions. We are seeing the difference in measurable changes in child mortality rates, in children's lives being saved. And I think, working towards internationally recognised targets such as the Sustainable Development Goals, which every country has to report on, the UK included, and including in the nutrition indicators, I think, that's the way that we can see and can actually measure what does this really look like in outcomes for real people, real communities, and are we making the right investments in those ways? George?
Can I speak to it? I think it's a brilliant question. And it goes right to the heart of so much of what government doesn't get right. Basically, Whitehall is 90% civil servants and 90% policy. If you ask them what they think they're doing, they like to make policy, they like to write policy, they like to issue documents. There's very little of the Whitehall mindset is about delivery, implementation, success. It's a real problem. That's the first point. Second point, if we're really going to drive healthier and cleaner growth off the back of this crisis, then in the end, if we're going to deliver net zero, we're going to have to quite profoundly change the way we eat. Meat will have to become something very special that we pay a lot more for, not cheap, low welfare processed meat. And in the end, consumer attitudes will have to change. So labeling becomes really key, trusted labeling and sustainability metrics. So when people pick up a piece of British meat versus a piece of Australian or Brazilian or whatever it is, beef that's come, they need to pick up the British piece of beef and go, well, it's a bit more expensive, but look, the metrics, it's a green tractor, not a red. It's less water, less chemicals, more humane travelling, better welfare. Creating those sustainability metrics integrated from field to fork is actually the big game changer for global agriculture. And that's why when I launched the Agri-Tech strategy, we set up an Agri-Metrics Institute. We've got to mainstream that to change consumer attitudes. Thirdly, science-wise, if you look at the data, the single biggest intervention you can make to shape your long-term life health chances is during pregnancy. The diet of the mother during pregnancy is the single biggest determinant of your long-term cardiometabolic life chances. Extraordinary science from the Institute of Child Health at UCL. So we know that what we should be doing is, if people knew that, to your point about fried chicken, you made the point. I think a lot of people would say, darling, when you're pregnant, we need to change your diet. We need to, and we need to destigmatize it and make it an investment in the next generation. But finally, unless we've got metrics, we won't tap into the ESG market. There is a wall of money coming from companies in the ESG sector. What they need is metrics. So if we go to them and say, would you invest in this project? It's helping 26 African villages improve their diet, their nutrition, and their outcomes. There's money out there, as long as these guys are helped to provide metrics that show that every dollar in is delivering these outcomes. It's absolutely key.
I'm just going to also respond on the comment about the chicken shops and living in a council estate in central London, very, very aware of the nutrition issues in community and having worked on both public health in the UK and global health issues. But I think the elephant in the room is access to affordable food as well. That is nutritious as well, because at the end of the day, whether it's children, whether it's families, if something is hot, it's satisfying, and it's £2, that's going to be the meal choice that you take. If you don't have access to high quality, high nutritious, affordable food, be that in the UK or be that in East Africa, then that's really at the crux as well. So how do we help to support people to make the right choices, including, like you say, during pregnancy and also as the child's growing, and support people to make healthy choices, but also how do we ensure that they are within reach and affordable and within access to everyone? And I think that's a really key issue. Okay, we have another question here, and I see we've only got 10 minutes. Great, we'll take you next, sir.
Hello. Very quick question, linking possibly immigration with international development. Some time ago, I was wandering through Mexico, and if you come into a town which has a good restaurant, it's very often run by someone who did work in America and has come home and brought that expertise back. If I look to where I grew up on Exmoor, a lot of the sheep farmers there, the best sheep farmers, they spent some time in New Zealand seeing how they rear sheep out there before coming back. And I wonder whether, to your point, George, early on, talking about development in other countries, whether if we said, come here, follow your dream, work for 5 years, and then take your expertise back. So it's not one-way immigration, it's come, learn some skills, take them back, whether that would benefit.
And I think also, Bashar, if you want to talk about the flow of skills between communities, I think that would be great.
Well, part of my development partnership idea is that if we had, say, 5 countries, let's just say, Kenya was one of them, then you'd have an exchange system with that country as well. And I think you then say, hey, guys, when you see 50,000 Kenyans or 10,000 Kenyans in the UK, don't be worried or cross or frightened, because guess what? 10,000 Brits are out in Kenya, building schools, building churches, laying the railway lines, working in aid and trade and security. This is a deep partnership. We're both benefiting. And then it's not just us nicking the best Kenyan people to work in the NHS for nothing, depriving Kenya of its development potential. It's us investing in them. And our kids come back having learned a bit more about how privileged they are to live in this country, less angry with things. And I just think it would be a really benign cycle. But tell me, do you think I've been on the wacky back?
Sorry.
No, it's all right. No, I think it's a really important question, and I think it's an important point to raise. It's about this brain circulation, this exchange of knowledge and experience, and actually the UK and other places would benefit from this kind of continuation of this cycle and exchange of ideas. For example, just with the diaspora in the African continent, when we talk about remittances, it's not for just in consumption. They invest in businesses in origin countries. So where you have, like in Africa, 80%, SMEs, dependent on this kind of informal sectors, and they play such an important role in that. And then the UK, look at the infrastructure in terms of, the NHS, look at the frontline workers who have played an important role. I'll bring the example of the Sudanese diasporas. You have a large community of, medical doctors here who, when the epicenter was in the UK, they were actually sharing that knowledge and what they've learned with their colleagues in Sudan. In terms of how to manage it. So there's something to be said about this kind of creating opportunities for this kind of circulation of knowledge. And this is why, the emphasis where we can always say, let's open up the discussions, let's have these partnerships, because at the moment, when you're talking about auditing, there's not enough actually evidence or data that kind of captures the experiences of migrant diaspora communities in terms of, I think people just think of like who's coming in and out, but let's look at the impact. How do you, look into it in more detail? So, I think that's a great kind of note to kind of continue on that. Thank you.
One quick point. I was looking last night at the UK, the National Food Strategy, and I did a search for Africa in a 160, 70-page document. It cropped up once in the references, in reference to the EU somewhere. And then there's a whole discussion on Canada, Australia, etc. I think there's a real opportunity to build stronger links with agribusinesses, particularly inclusive, smaller ones within Sub-Saharan Africa, within Asia, which is being missed at the moment. And that's something which could build into that point we're just discussing.
Thank you. We have another question in the room, and then we're going to go online for a couple. Sir, do you want to come up to the mic?
Thank you very much. Just so to layer my question, or probably more of a comment, is just also to give you an insight to what informs my approach and my thinking, because I have served with a subnational government in Sub-Saharan Africa. So we've been on the other end of this. There are three words that I pick, which you talked about, which is impact, outcomes. And I think that's really very significant, two words. Now, what George was talked about when he spoke, I thought, this man sees it, he gets it, he understands it. The next question for me is going to be how? Because I think that there's a lot happening. We see the impact of the British government. Aid is a key part of the British overseas strategy. It's a key part of it, so you can see that. But what is missing is the impact, and what is missing is implementation. How do you actually implement on ground? If I take Nigeria as an example, because it's a country that I know very well, there's 774 local governments in Nigeria, right? There's the population of Nigeria is 200 million plus. The state where I served has 33 local governments, and the population there is probably about 12 million. Now, I can confidently say that I would debate anyone on how do you measure the impact of that. But let me now give you a parallel example of why I also think impact and outcome. The rail network between Lagos, which is the capital city of Nigeria, and Ibadan, which is the capital city of Oyo State, was built or developed by the Chinese. Now, why I say that is because you see more of the Chinese. The Chinese come in and they don't think too much about SDGs. They just come and think about what will make an impact. So the impact of that rail network is that it's going to expand that route. But what you now see, which you talk about impact and outcome, is that the level of petty trading that exists on that route, your train is moving and the people are literally just there. There's just enough space for the train to move. Now, you would expect, if this was a British-led project, they would move everybody out. They wouldn't start the project until everybody's moved back because you're going to quote this and quote that. So what I'm trying to say is that really implementation is key to the delivery of this. The city, and I like the way you structure that. I would like to know more because I think for me that's the key. You've got to come with the money. I like what you said that about what you're doing in Sub-Saharan Africa and the impact. And again, it wasn't radical what you said because that's actually what the challenge is. The impact. How do you measure that? For me, the question that I put down is, what is malnutrition? How do you define malnutrition? When you drive along the road, you see children selling on the street. Some people will tell you, when you talk about COVID, when you look at how we talk about COVID here, you go to places in Africa, and they tell you malaria kills more people than COVID. So they don't really care about COVID. So again, it's good to think about these things from this perspective, but when it comes to implementation, you have to truly understand the terrain into which you're delivering into. That's actually the challenge. Now, if you're delivering into my state, for example, local government, we don't see it. The tractors are there, but they're just sitting there. Nobody monitors them. The spend comes in. Red Cross will come, medicines, they all come. They're all there. They all have offices, but the offices are in Lagos or in Victoria Island. And that's not where the development issues is. But the reason I'm saying this is because as you take these ideas forward, it's important to understand that it's actually how you implement it that's going to matter. Everything else is there, the resources, the brain power, the intellectual, the money is there. How you harness that, because you're right, financing agric business is a major challenge. But this is what happens when you talk about implementation. The money is going to come in from a DFI. They're going to warehouse the money in a bank, in a local bank. that bank is going to unlend that money and put a margin on it. And the bank is going to ask for collateral. What collateral are you going to provide? Now, as the DFI is concerned, when we report, we're going to say, well, we put $3 billion into this market. But what is the impact? Because that money is just sitting in the bank. The bank is just making it, they're doing treasury transactions on it. But the people who are supposed to benefit from it are not. So the answer to that is maybe when you come in with that money, you have to think about what structure are we going to use. I think yesterday in our discussions, we talked about structures. And that, I think, is going to be quite key. What structures are you going to put in place to ensure that the field to fork really, really happens, particularly when you have a massive diaspora. The diaspora investment in Africa, let's use Africa as an example, it's huge. You talk about 500 billion, I think it's even more than that. It's probably closer to $1 trillion. So again, implementation, how are you going to implement this in such a way that it has the impact and the outcome that you want to see on the SDGs? Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, I'm afraid we're at time. I unfortunately haven't been able to get to those additional questions. But let's keep the conversation going. I'm really excited that later on there's a conversation on innovative finance with some representatives from financial services in the city. How do we start thinking about structuring these conversations a little bit more? How do we look to support community-level partnerships, entrepreneurs who are driving economic growth, social change, but also those positive nutrition outcomes and factors? How do we work in smarter collaborations and keep driving this forward? But thank you so much. It's been great to hear from all of our panelists. A big thank you to everybody on the stage. And I think that Radix are helping us capture a lot of these ideas, but I won't hold you up any longer. Thank you so much, everyone.